is Underdog Portfolio Weekly, hosted by Scott Connor.
What's good, everyone? Welcome back to the show, Underdog Portfolio Weekly. Hopefully everybody has enjoyed the live drafts that I've done the last couple of weeks, and the live drafts that Ray and I have done head-to-head every Sunday night on Destination Chill. Expect more of that, where that has been streaming on the Destination Devy YouTube page. Expect a lot more Underdog live drafts. I have some great guests coming on to draft with me over the summer. But this show is just going to be a brief recap of where I sit after about, give or take, a month of drafting. The Best Ball Mania 5 opened up right after the NFL draft, and this is right at the end of May. So we are going to go through some things that I've learned in the first, say, quarter of the draft season. We're going to be drafting all the way up until opening weekend, so we're talking beginning of September. So I'm trying to batch these drafts together. I have almost 30 in the books. Right now, as we speak, I have 10 more that are ongoing and should be finished in Best Ball Mania 5. I also entered the Pomeranian, entered 50 entries. I may do a video specifically on that tournament and how I kind of played it out, given that I did almost all of those drafts, slow drafts. So it was kind of difficult to track the portfolio as you're going and doing 40 plus the slow drafts at one time. But this show is going to focus on Best Ball Mania 5, the portfolio aspect of it, and what I've learned from drafting, and just a couple things to follow up on the original video that I did a couple weeks ago. Again, this is my first time doing this on a portfolio level. I'm diving all the way in, applying some of my roster construction and portfolio strategies that I use for Dynasty and bringing that to the Underdog game. It's a little different. The draft rooms are different. Obviously, Underdog Best Ball is a different game than Dynasty. So I wanted just to do this show for me, but also for anybody out there that is doing some sort of strategy when it comes to Underdog portfolio this summer, whether it's Best Ball Mania 5 or whether it's the next Pomeranian or the Little Board or whatever else comes up. You have something to fall back on to say, you know what, I heard something on Scott's show, or that's something that he learned that I'm going to apply going forward. So this is just going to be kind of a recap of what I've learned in the first month of drafting. Again, I'm only about 20% of the way there. I can max enter Underdog, or I can max enter Best Ball Mania 5, 150 entries. I've completed 20, and I have another 10 that are going. So when these are done, we're going to be 20% of the way done. So I wanted to go through and just kind of see, are there any trends? Now, one big thing to keep in mind is that we haven't had a lot of new information since we started drafting. It was after the NFL draft. We've had a little buzz on players in OTAs and players getting some buzz or players that might be injured. You know, there's some little things here and there, but not a lot that has drastically changed the ADP. And I don't think we're going to get a lot over the next 4 to 6 weeks either. We're going to get some buzz, some hype. We're going to see influencers, drafters, talking heads, analysts, people out there that have a platform that go, you know what, I'm going to do a little more research into X player or Y player. And those players are naturally going to move up and move down in the ADP. But there's not going to be a lot of tangible information to say, I'm going to change how I'm drafting. So what I'm saying is I don't expect a massive change in ADP between now and, say, mid-July. So from 6 weeks, from now for 6 weeks, there's not going to be a massive amount of change in the ADP. Sure, there's going to be some players that move up, some players that move down, but it's going to be a big time for me because I'm going to have to get in another 30 to 50 drafts before training camp and preseason start. And I want to do that because I want to give myself this time to learn how I've drafted these first 30 teams, to see where there might be some blind spots, to see where there might be some overexposure or underexposure, to see where there may be some flaws in the way that I'm building teams, and give myself this window to fix it and try to draft some different teams, not maybe better valued teams, but just different teams. Otherwise, we're going to start the preseason, or at least training camp, and I'm going to have 75 teams that generally look the same, that was based on the same information. Then everything is going to change drastically. We're going to get preseason. We're going to get training camp injuries. We're going to get stuff that tangibly moves the ADP and the behavior of drafters. And I'm not going to be able to do enough drafts quick enough, especially if they're going to be slow drafts, to where you're going to be able to take advantage of that. So being able to kind of figure out how I'm going to pace the slow drafts versus the fast drafts, but also how I'm going to get enough in to make sure that I get the 150, because I don't want to be up against it where the last week I have to draft 40 teams and I'm constantly on my phone for literally a week straight where I'm drafting over and over and over, because you're not going to be able to do them all slow at the very end. You're going to have to hit in some fast drafts as well. So I don't want to get to that scramble point, because I also don't want to draft 50 teams in the last week or two, because then everybody is acting with all of that information the last week after the preseason ends. Everybody has that information as well. So it's really not an edge there either. So I'm just going to kind of go through some things that I'm going to highlight. I'm going to highlight the first thing is the Spike Week tool. Let me go ahead and get my screen shared here. So Spike Week tool, here we go. So yeah, with the Spike Week tool, it is spikeweek.com. If you're interested in purchasing it, you can buy it, and it really kind of helps you organize your thoughts and whatnot when it comes to how you're drafting these underdog teams. And I'm just sharing this screen for everybody to see. This is the screen where you go through and go to your draft IQ tier or draft IQ screen, and you just highlight your exposures. And this is where I'm going to stay for much of this episode. So the first thing is it's going to be able to sort it by tournament. So you can do by everything, or you can just sort by Best Ball Mania, the Pomeranian, and the Pug. I did max enter the Pug, which was the 3 max entry limit, $12 tournament. I would implore anybody out there that likes this content but doesn't have the bankroll to say, hey, I'm just going to max enter Best Ball Mania 5, or I'm going to drop 150 entries on this next $5 tournament. Still a lot of money. It's still $750 if you want to do that. If there's another tournament, and I think there's going to be some, like the Pug, where it's max entry of 10, max entry of 5, max entry of 3, like really focus on doing that. If you want to dive into this, but you don't have a bankroll where you go, I'm comfortable dropping, $1,000 or $750 on Underdog and having to draft 150 teams. Not everybody wants to draft 150 teams. As much as we sit here and say, I love to draft that many teams, not everybody really wants to dive into committing to 150 or even 50 teams. So you can sort by tournament. So we're going to focus just on the Best Ball Mania 5 teams. And so we're going to go through each one of these screens, and I'm just going to kind of highlight a couple things. So the first thing is teams drafting one or more players from these specific teams. And as you can see, it just literally highlights the teams that drafted one or more players from the following teams. So every single team adding up 17 times. I drafted multiple Pittsburgh Steelers. 17 times. Drafting at least a Pittsburgh Steeler. 15 on Seattle and Arizona. So this just tells you what is the most popular in terms of players you've drafted. This is just drafting one or more players from an individual team, and it goes down all the way to the bottom. Not a lot of Buffalo Bills in Best Ball Mania 5 thus far. And I actually, now that I think about it, I drafted a lot more Josh Allen with some Bills players in the Pomeranian, because just subconsciously I'm sitting there thinking I don't have a lot of exposure in BBM 5. So this just kind of tells you who are the teams that I'm drafting a lot of and who are the teams that I'm not drafting a lot of. Then you go over here, teams drafting multiple players. So if teams where I've drafted multiple players from one individual NFL team, 7 times I've drafted multiple Steelers. Seattle, Cincinnati, Tennessee, Philadelphia, Minnesota, all the way down the line. 5 teams I've never drafted multiple players in one draft. So right there, just thinking logically, 0 on Washington, New England, the Jets, Buffalo, or Las Vegas. And again, this includes the teams that are not completed yet. So there's still some that haven't shown up on here. That this Spike Week only is measuring the teams that are completed on Underdog. So I believe I have 20 completed right now versus the 30 that I've entered. But there's some teams in here where I go, you know what? I do not have stacks of these players. And it makes sense with Las Vegas because I haven't drafted any Las Vegas quarterbacks. Haven't drafted any Josh Allen. Haven't drafted any Drake May. Now, Jaden Daniels, Aaron Rodgers, there's been a couple teams where I've tried to get those guys, whether it's for the stack itself or for the bring back. I know for sure that I've had some teams that have Atlanta or Philadelphia heavy builds, and I've tried to get Jaden Daniels on the opposite because he's playing them in week 16 and 17, but I haven't been able to get any Jaden Daniels. And I know the same with Aaron Rodgers. There have been a couple teams where I've had Garrett Wilson and I've tried to get Aaron Rodgers, or I've had Buffalo and I haven't been able to get Aaron Rodgers. So it just hasn't worked out with these teams. And it's not shocking that the Jets play Buffalo, and I haven't really managed to secure any stacks from those games. So just something to keep in mind, that maybe I have a blind spot for some of those teams. Maybe I have a blind spot for some of the players. And it's not shocking because there's probably a blind spot on most players that are not Garrett Wilson, Josh Allen, maybe James Cook, maybe Breece Hall. But there's not a lot of other options that have been appealing to me. Does that mean that they're going to be more appealing now just because I don't have any? No. But just something to keep in mind. Maybe next time I'm doing a live draft and it makes sense, maybe I'll draft a couple Bills. Maybe I'll draft a couple Jets. There's definitely some Raiders to draft. There's 2 Raiders receivers to draft. There's a tight end and there's a running back, all of them within the top 60 or better at receiver, top 24 or better at running back and tight end. But I just haven't managed to build any stacks. And it's probably because those have been ones where if I look at the Raiders are playing Atlanta, Jacksonville, and New Orleans in week 15, 16, 17. I've kind of just used the Raiders as maybe an ability to stack the other teams. And it hasn't been that I'm building a Raiders stack per se, because I haven't drafted any Raiders quarterbacks. If I want to change that, that's something I have to discern. If I want to make the Raiders stack something I want to do now, I would lean towards no, because if you look at the ADP, we'll go over to the Underdog ADP here at quarterback. So if you go down to the ADP at quarterback and you get to the low-end QBs here, you're getting to QB, let's call it 26, Bryce Young, and down, Drake May, Justin Fields, Daniel Jones, Bo Nix, Russell Wilson. Pretty much when you get to Russell Wilson, randomly you may see a quarterback down here get drafted, but it's unlikely. So what that's telling me is that nobody's really drafting Gardner Minshew or Aiden O'Connell. Now, it doesn't mean I want to, but I have to weigh, okay, if it's clear that one of them is going to win the job, and this is talking through some of the game theory of this tournament, knowing that the drafts started in May and go till September. Now, let's assume that one of these 2 QBs pulls away in training camp. They look okay in the preseason, because I assume both are going to play a decent amount in the preseason. And then one of them is the clear head and shoulders favorite to be the starter. That quarterback's probably going to start getting drafted, right? People start drafting in August and early September. They're going to draft one of these 2 Raiders QBs. But where are they going to go? Let's say it's Aiden O'Connell. Beats out Gardner Minshew. Where does he move to? Does he move ahead of Drake May, Derek Carr, Bryce Young? Probably not. Probably settles right in this range where he's getting drafted, but he's like the last quarterback or the second to last quarterback to draft off the board. So that leads me to believe, do I even want to draft him today? Because there's also a chance that I picked the wrong one and I'm getting a 0. But there's really no closing line value on drafting him today, even if he ends up being the starter and I'm right. I'm getting a 18th round pick today for maybe a 17th round pick at best in August. So it feels like it's correct to not draft any Raiders quarterbacks until you know who it's going to be. So if you're going to get exposure to the Raiders, you're going to have to probably make it a priority to build some of those stacks with the other teams. Jacksonville and New Orleans are their week 16 and week 17 opponents. And if you check how much exposure I have to those, 1 team with multiple Jags, Saints, okay, 3 teams with multiple Saints. But the point is I really haven't prioritized the Saints or the Jags either. Thus, it makes sense that I don't have a lot of teams that have multiple Raiders. There just really hasn't been a reason to. So that's one of the takeaways that I've had, is looking at some of these teams that have correlation in week 16 and week 17. And I think week 16 is a little more important than people are talking about, just given the payouts, because you got to get there. If you can manage to get 2 teams to the finals, the payouts are in a way where you're going to be in good shape this year if you can get 2 teams to the finals. But a lot of the teams are going to get knocked out because they don't have any correlation in week 16. And we'll get to that here in a second. But one thing that I'm going to take away from this is to look at these ones where maybe I only have a couple pieces. So the Giants, Carolina, and some of these may because they're pretty expensive to get, right? San Fran, Kansas City, Chicago, they're tough to get in certain circumstances because a lot of their players go pretty early. So unless you're in the right draft spot And unless you're not going against somebody else that's trying to build, like the reason I probably don't have a lot of San Francisco is because the San Francisco stacks are usually spoken for within the first 2 or 3 rounds. As soon as you see Debo, Ayuk, Amon-Ra, and Laporta go off the board, those are the teams that are probably focusing on getting the Lions. Those are the teams that may take Jamison Williams, that may take Ricky Pearsall, that may take Jawan Jennings and target George Kittle and make sure they get one of Brock Purdy and Jared Goff. But those are usually spoken for. So kind of just going through, if I haven't taken a lot of those players, I really haven't targeted any stacks in that game. Maybe it's a mistake. I don't know. But you can notice there's some in here that there's a lot of teams chasing. A lot of teams chasing Baltimore, Chicago, San Francisco, Kansas City. Jacksonville, I think a lot of people are chasing some Jacksonville stacks. There's tons of players involved with Jacksonville. But I'm going to focus on, all right, maybe start building some teams around these. Because there's not going to be a lot of change in ADP, which means I'm going to need to change some behaviors with how I'm drafting to make sure I build some of these teams. So we'll go through my exposure here in a second, but I just wanted to highlight that that is the main screen that I'm using. This is probably a very loose measurement of my correlation thus far and how I've kind of stacked some of these games. And maybe I should lay off a little bit of the Seattle, Cincinnati, Philadelphia, Arizona, Rams, Pittsburgh. You know, it's funny. I have a lot of Pittsburgh, but not a lot of Kansas City. And it's usually because I have Kansas City players, but they might be a one-off. And it makes sense because I've drafted tons of Justin Fields, which we'll get to in just a second. But if I've drafted 7 teams with Justin Fields, because I think he does have tons of closing line value, meaning if he's named the starter, he's going in round 8 or round 9, and you can get him in round 17 or round 18. So I think he's a great pick at the current price, and I'm probably going to continue to do that. What I should do is if I'm going to continue to draft Fields, though, I should maybe change up who I'm stacking with. Maybe less George Pickens, less Roman Wilson, less Pittsburgh running backs, more Pat Freiermuth, maybe Travis Kelce, because I don't have any Travis Kelce in Best Ball Mania 5. And then maybe just a one-off bring back could be with Isaiah Pacheco. Doesn't have to be with Xavier Worthy or Hollywood Brown, which you always have your choice between those two, which is probably why I have the bringbacks that I have with those. I'm usually going, all right, I know I'm going to take Justin Fields. So I drafted George Pickens, Justin Fields, and I got Rashee Rice. There you go. So I maybe want to focus a little bit different in terms of my builds if I'm going to continue to draft some of these teams. Seattle's so easy to draft because you can get Geno Smith late. Seattle's schedule is just ripe between Green Bay and Chicago in week 15 and 17. There's tons of correlation to be had. There's 2 early receivers with Minnesota that you can correlate with. There's some late round players with Minnesota you can correlate with Ty Chandler and TJ Hawkinson. So Seattle is probably the easiest team this year to find just correlation all over the board because their players are all over the board. You know, they have 3 top 50 receivers, but none of them are going inside the top 20. So they're easier to get even if you don't have a specific draft spot. They have 2 running backs going inside the top 40-ish. Again, none of them are going inside the top 10, though, so you don't have to have a specific pick. So you notice that you don't need to go into the draft saying, I'm going to correlate Seattle and Chicago, for instance. But I can do it after I have missed out on some of the other stacks. And that's what I have noticed a lot of people have done is they go for something and then they realize, well, I can't get that, but I can get DK Metcalf here and I can get Rome Odunze there, and then I can get Caleb Williams and I can get Noah Fant. All of a sudden, I've built myself a stack, and I didn't have to decide that until round 3 or beyond. So that's what I've noticed I've done a lot. So maybe on those, you back off just a little bit and maybe play those games a little bit of a different way. So less Seattle, less Tennessee. Mentioned I don't have much Jacksonville. Ton of Tennessee, not a lot of Jacksonville. So maybe I flip that. A lot of Philadelphia. A little bit less Dallas. So you get the point. Maybe just using this screen as a way to figure out where I might have some blind spots and maybe some players or some games that I've been ignoring. And just to highlight that, you can go down here to week 17 stacks, and there you go. This highlights exposures that you have to the stacks. So the stacks are the correlative plays that you have with each one of these games in week 17. 23% exposure to Seattle, Chicago. 23% to KC, Pittsburgh. Now, again, those are more Seattle and Pittsburgh than they are KC and Chicago. So it makes it important to figure out where those sides are coming from. But those are the games I'm most exposed to. Tons of Atlanta. I know I don't have a lot of Washington. Arizona and the Rams, pretty equal. Right here, as you notice, a lot of Saints, not a lot of Las Vegas. Although I have a lot of exposure to that game. And then down, as you can see, 17% on Miami and Cleveland, 13. Then down here, Jets, Buffalo, only one exposure. Chargers, New England, only one exposure. So these are the games here where I have not correlated a lot. And there's some that you might be able to spot and go, that should be easy to do. Yeah, Baltimore, Houston. Don't have any Lamar Jackson. I don't believe I have any Lamar Jackson in Ball Mania 5. So that's another one where I know I have some CJ Stroud, but I haven't gotten the other side of that. So really drilling down, like even the games you have a lot of exposure to, where's the exposure and can you get it differently? Because it's not shocking that I pick some of these games, right? Dallas, Philly, Arizona, LA, Atlanta, Washington, Seattle, Chicago. Like you're picking these games for a reason. You know, you like the teams maybe a little better than you like some of these games down here. But the point is, how do I build those now that I have some pretty decent exposure to some of them in certain ways? And I thought this was interesting. Roster build. So this tells me my construction on all the teams thus far. Now, these were some teams I did early. Some 3-5-7-3 builds. I'm going to start backing off on that. More and more I listen, and again, I'm still a novice at this. I'm still learning on the fly, you know, what is best in terms of truly getting to the very end. And just there's too much out there that says 3 tight ends and 3 quarterbacks really is leaving some meat on the bone. Could it be successful? Yeah, I mean, it's advanced to the finals in the past, but it's not one of the ones where I would go, that is how I'm going to get there. Instead, I'd rather focus on doing this. These are the 2 most popular builds. After that, where I'm going 3-5-8-2 or 2-5-8-3, meaning I'm only going 5 total at quarterback and at tight end. And that's easy to do at tight end if you just go all crusty tight ends at the end. But it's also easy to do if you go 3 late quarterbacks. With the key being, you're probably going a little bit more at the other position, or you're at least going at least 1 player higher at quarterback or tight end if you're only going with 2. You're not necessarily going 2 tight ends and having them be 2 tight ends in the last 3 rounds. Same with quarterback. You're probably not going, I'm only drafting 2 quarterbacks, but it's Derek Carr and Geno Smith. You can do that, but I would recommend maybe making it, if you know you're going 2 tight ends, take a quarterback early. Grab Lamar, and then you only need 1 more. You know, grab Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts. You can probably pick the cutoff wherever you want it to be. Joe Burrow, Dak Prescott, Kyler Murray, wherever you think that cutoff is where you can afford to only go 2, build some teams like that. So this is interesting that I've started shifting towards this right here in terms of my primary builds, 2-5-8-3 or 3-5-8-2, which basically means it allows me 13 spots for running back and receiver. Now to drill down to that a little bit even more, you go over here to the team structure and you go, okay, well, 5 running backs, right? Like that's the consistent thing with these 2 builds, 5 running backs and 8 receivers, which means I'm typically drafting 2 running backs a little bit higher. I haven't thus far had the stones to go hero RB or 0 RB. And there's a little cheat sheet on Spike Week. I don't have it shared under this tab, but there's a little cheat sheet in Spike Week that kind of defines what those actually mean. And the way that you get to that is essentially go into the help tab, but essentially they define hero RB as 1 running back drafted inside the top 12 and no other running back inside the top 24. And then 0 running back mean no running backs inside the top 24, and that's by ADP. So obviously that'll flip-flop depending on where players move up and where players move down. But what I've opted for the most is this dual running back, and then that's been it. Meaning I've basically built almost every team the exact same way. This dual running back, 2 running backs inside the top 24. Now, typically, when we go to my exposures here in a second, you will not see a lot of exposure to the early running backs. But I'm definitely taking running backs before I'm going 6 receivers. Before I'm going 4 receivers, quarterback, tight end. I'm usually locking in 2 top 24 running backs. So maybe I'm getting my first one around the Aaron Jones, David Montgomery, Ramondre Stevenson range, and then I'm hitting another one right in that same range. And then even further, I'm taking my RB3, my RB4. You'll see when I get to the exposure where my most concentrated exposure to running backs are thus far. It's in that RB20 to 40 range. The guys where I go, I don't care if they're in a committee. These are players I'm confident are going to have volume early on. Now, I probably have to change that up. Do I start building some early running back teams? I did that in the Pomeranian. I started with numerous teams, going Breece Hall, Jonathan Taylor, Bijan Robinson, Saquon Barkley, Jahmyr Gibbs, Breece Hall, or Jahmyr Gibbs, Jonathan Taylor, Jahmyr Gibbs, Saquon Barkley. There's 5 running backs I'm very interested in taking. I just haven't taken a ton in Best Ball Mania 5. But if you talk about Breece, Bijan, and Gibbs going in the first, and then Barkley and Jonathan Taylor going in the early to mid-second, if you have picks outside of the top 6, you can easily take a shot on going RB. At least this year, it lines up perfectly. Not every draft, because some drafts, Bijan and Breece will go both in the top 7. And then Justin Jefferson falls to the 108, or Amon-Ra St. Brown falls to the 108. But you can do it, and I started doing it in the Palm, but I haven't done it in Best Ball Mania yet. So that's something that I'm going to probably start changing just a little bit, building some teams where I go extremely early running back, robust RB, 3 running backs in the top 24 by ADP. So you may go RB, then you take a receiver, then you take another receiver, then you go down with one more running back. You take Ramondre Stevenson or somebody like that, and that's going to be the robust running back. So I haven't done that a lot either, so that's something that I may want to change. And then you go down here and you just look at quarterback stacks, quarterbacks that I've stacked the most with their receivers. Justin Fields 6 times. Now, obviously, this also correlates with the exposure that I have. So clearly, most of these I've probably stacked with at least one of their weapons. Fields, Levis, Burrow, Goff, Richardson, all the way down. And then there's some where I only have one team stack. And then these tabs, week 15, week 16, week 17, as this updates, you can go through and kind of track which exposures you have to which games. And then you can drill down even further and see where you are with each one of those games. So I recommend this tool a lot, especially if you're going to do a lot of leagues. It'll track up here how many teams you have, how much money you have in there, how many teams you've drafted per tournament, and it'll constantly update as soon as you run the updater or the refresher. It'll run all this data, and then you can view it here all on one screen. So let's go over here to my exposures, and we're just going to kind of highlight what I have through Best Ball Mania 5 thus far through 20 leagues. So as you can see in here, up top, I've drafted 20 teams, 21 different quarterbacks. So that's something to keep in mind. Like there's probably 30 to 32 picks at quarterback that have been drafted. I probably have some blind spots. There's some guys I do not have any of. So what I probably want to do is go through and see, okay, who is that? What quarterbacks do I have zero exposure to? And it probably correlates with some of those teams where I don't have a lot of exposure to those players or those stacks. And maybe consider, all right, next time I'm doing a live draft and it makes sense, you have the Spike Week tool in the live draft room that'll update and show you your exposure. That can always give you like a buffer to make sure that you're aware of it before you hit draft. Just keep that in mind. I don't want to go where I end up with 24% Joe Burrow and I have 2% Justin Herbert. Probably don't want to go that drastic with 2 guys that the market prefers one over the other. But in terms of their range of outcomes, is it really that much different to where I need to have so much more exposure? And again, it's easier to build the Burrow teams. So you probably have to decide that early. Whereas the Herbert stacks, for instance, the reason I don't have them is I've probably already committed a bunch of capital to receivers. And I go, okay, now I'm sitting here because I've tried to build a couple Herbert stacks. And it's when you decide mid-draft, hey, Herbert's still sitting out there. It's round 11. He's still on the board. I can draft him, but how am I going to correlate, right? They play New England. There's a lot of options you can go with those teams. Both Chargers tight ends, Hunter Henry, 3 Patriots receivers, 3 Chargers receivers. And then all the running backs except for Ramondre Stevenson are cheap. So you should be able to do it, but you have to decide that mid-draft. There's been a couple times where I go, you know what? This is the time to pivot and take a Herbert stack. But I haven't done it because maybe I already have 2 quarterbacks. Or maybe I already have 6 receivers. And I know really what I want to do is I want to draft multiple receivers remaining, but I'm hammering running backs in that range instead. So you kind of have to decide a little bit early. So that's going to be one that's going to be on my radar. So just looking at the exposure, As you can see, 7 drafts thus far, 35% of Justin Fields. I haven't decided what my percentage on Fields is going to be. Probably going to cap it at around 30%. So I'm going to continue to draft them at a similar rate. And then there's going to be a point where it's either positive for him or it's not. And when we get to September, if it's clear that he's just not going to start, that's when I'll examine all my exposure and say, okay, if I already have 32 teams out of 100 with Justin Fields, I'm probably good. I don't need to draft him anymore. I should have more information on some of the other players going in that range, notably the receivers and tight ends in terms of what their jobs are going to be. So I'll stop drafting Fields and I'll shift to drafting some different tight ends and some different receivers. Have some Joe Burrow, 20% Burrow and Levis, Goff, Tua, Kyler Murray, Trevor Lawrence, Anthony Richardson. And then you get down to the 10% guys, Cousins, Stafford, Watson. You notice Jalen Hurts, QB2. I have 2 shares of Jalen Hurts, 1 share of Justin Herbert. Don't have a lot of Jordan Love. You didn't notice any Lamar Jackson. No, 1 Lamar Jackson. You didn't notice any Josh Allen. 1 CJ Stroud. 1 Jordan Love. So these are ones I'm sitting here going Lamar, Stroud, Love, Herbert, Hurts, Josh Allen, 0 of. Like those are ones I can probably shift and start drafting a little bit more. So quarterbacks are quarterbacks. I've drafted 21 different ones. Here's where I think is the most interesting. Running backs. Running backs. I've only drafted 43 different running backs. What does that tell you? Well, obviously I've only done 20 completed drafts, but what it tells you is I'm generally sticking to the roster construction principles of draft running backs with roles. And maybe that's a flaw. That is my dynasty best ball roster construction mindset. And if you've heard my roster construction series on Destination Dynasty, it's basically been, I want running backs inside a certain threshold. Now here in Underdog, we're talking about an even shallower format, right? Like we're not talking about 11 starters, 10 starters. We're talking about less. So that threshold is lower. So for me in my mind, it's like RB 50 or higher. And generally, I'm just not taking shots on running backs later than that. So you can see through the exposure, Blake Corum, 35%. Trey Benson, Tajay Spears, 30%. Look where these guys are going. Corum, RB 39. Spears, RB 37. Benson, RB 30. Najee Harris, okay, RB 23. Joe Mixon, RB 15. Jaylen Warren, 25. Jalen Wright, 46. Ty Chandler, 47. Rashad White, 14. So between Joe Mixon and Rashad White, those have basically been the highest exposed or highest valued running backs I've drafted multiple times. Even more down here, Chase Brown, 38, Pollard, 27, Javonte, 31, Brian Robinson, 33, James Conner, 28, Singletary, 32. So you notice, where am I drafting most of my running backs? In between that 25 to 40 range. I'm hammering them. 25%, 20%, 15%. Like that's where I'm hitting running back. Then you go down even further. The 2 Zeke Elliott's that I took were the very first couple drafts. Now he's going right at RB 40. Not really a value anymore. So then you get down further. I do have 2 Breece Hall. I do have 2 Bijan Robinson. Then you go down even further. I don't even believe I have any other high-end running backs that you see on here. 1 Travis Etienne at RB 10. A couple more randos. Clyde Edwards-Helaire. Okay, there's a Jahmyr Gibbs at RB 4. But you notice there's not a lot of names in there that you expect that are going off the board inside the top 20 running backs. You didn't see a Derrick Henry on there. You know, you didn't see some of those other guys. You didn't see a Kenneth Walker on there. You didn't see any of those running backs going inside the top 15 or so. And it's just been a blind spot. No Saquon, no Jonathan Taylor. Now, I learned this as I started to go through this data over the last week. I started changing these up in the Pomeranian. But that's another thing that's been on my radar. I'm going to have to build some anchor, whether it's hero RB or not, I'm going to have to build a couple anchored teams where maybe I still go a robust RB, but it's a first round running back. It's Jonathan Taylor or Saquon in the early second. And then I get my second running back. Sure, that can be in round 5. That's fine. It's still the 2 in the top 24, but it's a different build. It's not just receiver, 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 receiver. So that's a habit that I probably have to break, although studying the war data, and again, I don't have the war data pulled up either here, but studying the war data, which I kind of went through on the first episode of Underdog Portfolio Weekly, the war data tells me I really don't want to draft Josh Jacobs relative to the price on Najee Harris. Like, generally, you don't want to make that bet. So there's subconsciously a reason that I'm not doing it. Although if I'm drafting 150 teams, I want to have at least, 5% or less exposure to almost every running back that's in the player pool. Let's go to receivers. Receivers, you'll notice a similar thing. A lot of exposure to some receivers that are in that just threshold receiver range. Okay, JSN, got a lot of JSN. He's easy to click. He's wide receiver 43. I know he wasn't great last year, but there's receivers going 2 rounds higher than him, and I go, the range of outcomes are very similar. Jordan Addison, wide receiver 39. Jerry Jeudy, that's kind of a random one. That's one where I think I've tried to build some Watson stacks, haven't been successful, but it's also been on ones where I've had Miami receivers early, or I've had Miami players early, so it makes it easy just to take Jerry Jeudy. So I've definitely aligned him on some teams where I really didn't have a plan. Like Jerry Jeudy, maybe a little bit higher than his ADP. Roman Wilson, not a shock here that Roman Wilson and George Pickens are in the top 6 in terms of my rostership, given how much Justin Fields I have. Then you have some of these other guys, Jalen Waddle. You notice a lot of early receivers. If you go past Jalen Waddle, 17, Drake London, 10, Jamar Chase, 3, Devontae Smith, 21, Pittman, 22, Higgins, 27, Neighbors, 20, Dell, 26, Olave, 12, all the way down, Debo, 14, Cooper Kupp, 24, Nico Collins, 15, all of these guys on multiple teams. So it looks way different than the running backs. Now, again, it's best ball. Are there some opportunities for me to take some receivers later that I don't have a lot of exposure to? I'm opting to use some of the volatility of training camp and whatnot to change some of the receivers that I take late. What you notice here is I haven't strayed a ton outside of the top 70 or so. There's some random exposure to like Jalen Hyatt on a couple teams and Demario Douglas, but I have not really gone deep enough to say, okay, there's going to be some other array of receivers that I draft. Like Ray always says, scroll down and take somebody random that you haven't taken. Again, for me, it's the closing line value. Yeah, there's going to be some random receivers that pop off in those ranges. And if you can correlate the random wide receiver 117 with the game stack that you already have, that's fine. But there's no value gain. Let's just take one that I've drafted, for instance, as a late round receiver. Let's take Trey Tucker, for instance. It's Ray's guy, Trey Tucker. He always says, take Trey Tucker. I got one share of Trey Tucker. Now, again, no Raiders quarterbacks. So in what world does Trey Tucker ever go anywhere but round 18? Meaning, unless I have a specific reason to take him, what is the difference between him and anybody else? He's not going to go anywhere. He's just going to be probably a lower owned player in the tournament. So take some random shots. That's really all it is. So I just haven't opened that up because I still have 120 more teams to draft. But there's not really any fear of receivers that you're taking down in this range. Andre Yosevas, Jacob Cowing. You're not losing anything by drafting those guys, but you're also not, there is no world where you gain anything with those guys. They never will go anywhere but at round 18. So you're not like fearful of missing out on drafting Andre Yosevas today, because even if the best case scenario was like T. Higgins didn't show up to camp, Andre Yosevas is going to go round 18. Like he's still going to go in the same range. So there's just not really any reason to be super aggressive on getting different receivers because there's nothing to gain on them. So I thought that was interesting. I mean, I've only drafted 75 different receivers. We know in a given year, there's more than like 100, 110 of them at least that will put up a top 36 week. I believe last year, the last couple of years, it's been like 120 to 130 receivers that put up a top 36 weeks. So there's way more relevant receivers than what I've drafted thus far. But it's also shallow enough to where, since we're limited to 18 roster spots per team, that it's probably not going to get to a point where I have more than maybe 90 total. So it's just going to be those one-offs that I have to decide, do I like this player more than that player? But it's interesting that I've drafted 75 different ones because it's probably around 120 to 130 in a given year that will post at least one top 36 week, which means it's hitting your lineup. Most likely that's hitting your lineup, even in a team where there's only one extra flex spot. So keep that in mind. And then tight ends. Here's where tight ends, it just depends on your build, whether you're taking 3 late ones or you're taking an early one and a mid-round one, whatever it is, whether it's a 2 build or a 3 build. I clearly have my biases. Noah Fant. I early on, I just took a couple Noah Fant, completely unstacked, uncorrelated. I just said, you know what, give me Noah Fant. So I probably have Noah Fant and JSN on a couple teams that have no correlation, just because early on I was going Noah Fant's better than his value. But I've kind of learned that, hey, if I'm going to draft Noah Fant aggressively, I probably want to align him with as many other Bears and Seahawks stacks, or even the Week 16 matchup that they had that I was talking about earlier. They have Minnesota. Align him on teams where I take Jordan Addison or Justin Jefferson or both. And then you go down, it's pretty even, like not a lot of high exposure. I've mixed around the tight ends. As you see, a lot of late tight ends, Gesicki, Jawan Johnson, Chigakonkwo, Luke Musgrave, Colby Parkinson, all these guys outside the top 10. Do have a couple in there. Sam Laporta. Do have 3 Laportas. And then have a couple other high-end ones like Goddard and Kittle. But for the most part, it's pretty much just been late round tight end, going with 3 tight end builds. And then the ones that I don't, those are the ones where if I'm drafting Laporta, or even if I'm drafting George Kittle, Trey McBride, Travis Kelce, any of these are going to be on 2 tight end builds. So just kind of understanding, again, where those stacks are, and when I take some ones that I don't have a lot of exposure to, how I want to build around them. So that's the exposure through 20 drafts. I'm going to go ahead and unshare my screen because there's been a lot that I've gone over here. But back to the idea of how I'm going to play this out the rest of the season. Because I think the one thing that I really need to focus on is getting out of drafting the same way. Because I could go through and say, I know what the war looks like. I know how I want to build, whether it's the 2-5-8-3 or 3-5-8-2, maybe some more extreme drafts where I go 2-5-9-2 or 2-6-8-2, meaning I go early tight end, early quarterback, and then probably a second tight end or second quarterback, not in the last round. Then I only need 2. And then I just roll with as many skill players as possible. So I think the big thing and the big takeaway for me is a lot of the teams I've drafted the same. Maybe not the same players, maybe not the same stacks, but the flow of the draft has been very much receiver, receiver, receiver. Hell, maybe a 4th receiver, a couple times a 5th receiver, knowing that there's that pocket of running backs between RB 25, 45-ish, where I can still get 3 or 4 of those guys. And that feels like the dominant way to build. However, if I keep building teams like that, I'm going to end up with tons of Tajay Spears. I'm going to end up with tons and tons of Trey Benson, Blake Corum. I'm going to keep taking them because they're going to be there. Now, sure, I can mix up within those builds. So I'm not going to abandon those builds. I'm going to start taking Gus Edwards. I'm going to start taking some Zach Moss, some Zeke Elliott, some Rico Dowdle, some Austin Eckler, guys I have none of. That is the hardest part for me, is knowing that I'm on the right track with the team build, but that I have blind spots on the players. So it's not just changing up the team build and changing up the stacks, but it's examining, why do I not have a lot of those stacks? Why do I not have any Austin Eckler? And being cognizant that I can still build a team the same way, but I go Zach Moss and Austin Eckler instead of going Jalen Warren and Tajay Spears. And I'm sitting there going, I'm talking myself into it on the clock. Man, I got to go Tajay over Eckler. He has so much more upside. Then you go, all right, but I don't want 29% Tajay Spears and 0% Austin Eckler. I can stomach balancing that to 21 and 6%. And those are the portfolio decisions that until you really do a lot of teams, you really don't start thinking about it. If you were only going to do 10 teams, I would say draft them all the way you want that fits your construction, but don't be worried if you have 9 of one player and 0 of another. It doesn't matter. But if you're doing 150, I have to keep reminding myself that diversifying within the right build is something that I can do easily without changing how I'm drafting. The harder part is change how I'm drafting. If I change how I draft and I go running back, I'm probably not even going to be looking at the running backs that are available. And again, that's a little bit of a flaw too. When you're trying to plan how you're going to draft, you may be in a draft room where you go RB, you feel great. And then you realize, damn, this is a receiver heavy draft. And I drafted right into everybody else's hands. And now what I'm trying to make up on the other end, I'm chasing because the receivers are going off the board 5% faster than they would typically. So I'm skipping over running backs where I should have just gone, all right, I don't want to take a third running back here, but Travis Etienne is there at the 410. He shouldn't be there. He should be gone. But I already have Saquon and Jahmyr Gibbs. How can I take Etienne? Yeah, be able to shift on the fly. You know what? If I do that, I might even go 3 running backs. I don't probably want to go 3, but my 4th may be, think of one that goes at the very end, Clyde Edwards-Helaire. Somebody you're taking at the very, very end of the draft. They need 2 injuries, Will Shipley, Evan Hall, that type. That's my 4th. And balance what you're spending at each position, not just the construction, but based on where you spent the early capital, and balance it out. So that's something that I'm still learning. That's draft by draft. That's where the Spike Week tool helps. That's where the slow drafts help, because you can see that stuff on the fly. You don't have to watch it playing out. I made a mistake and I tried to draft 3 live drafts at one time. Don't recommend it. Don't recommend it. I have 3 phones. I'm sitting here going, I can draft 3 lives at once. Nah, not a good idea. There's no way you're actually tracking 3 boards and paying attention to 3 player pools at one time. And of course, there were a couple times during the draft where all were on the clock within like 1 minute or less. Just don't recommend it. Probably 2 max, but if you want to get in, especially if there's another tournament that is a lower cost buy-in and you want to max it out, I would recommend like 80-20 lives and slow drafts. If it's 50 entries, fire off some random lives just so you can have fun, chill, sit there on the couch, do a live draft. You can obviously do that and have some fun. But if it's 150 lives and it's $5 a piece and you go, you know what, that's $750. I'm going to max enter this. Register for 100 slow drafts. And it may take a little while for him to finish, but the slow drafts allow you to actually play the board, and it also allows you to check some of your biases while you're drafting in those slow drafts. Right now, between the Pomeranian and Ball Mania 5, I have like 60 drafts going on at one time, and it's tough to manage. But at least when I have this tool, I can go in and I can study the board. It takes 5 minutes. I spend 45 minutes at a time, go through and hit all my picks out. Get them all done, but I can study each board. What's available? What have I built? What have I already built in the past? What correlation do I have going forward? So it's definitely a challenge to manage this mini, but it's not going to slow down. So I'm going to embrace it, continue to refine your process. With that, hopefully everybody's enjoying this episode. Leave some feedback, leave some comments. Again, this is my first foray. So I am literally documenting how I am approaching this, but also what I am learning. And I do not have all the answers. Heck, I haven't liked either of the live drafts that I've done with Ray on Destination Chill. I like the ones that I did on here better, but I haven't liked the ones that I've done with Ray. And I don't really think Ray liked his teams much. It's funny. We're drafting together. We're talking through the board, and either one of us didn't love what we had put together, but that's part of it. So maybe some more coming on the psychology of other drafters. I'm going to have a lot of great guests coming on in the summer to draft with me. I'll draft the team and they'll literally be there talking it through with me, not drafting against me. Because I think if I'm drafting against a guest, it kind of kills the conversation. We're both focused on our own team. I'm trying to share the screen. I'm trying to host the show. So we're just going to draft the team. It's going to be my team, but we're going to draft it together. And the host is going to have input with me, or the co-host is going to have input with me on what we draft. And it might actually help me check my biases a little bit. And that's what I want. So I'm going to draft with other people coming on to live draft with me every Wednesday night. So if you're tuning into this, next Wednesday, we'll have another live draft. And then going forward all throughout the summer, it'll mostly be live drafts. Originally, I'd said it's going to be a recorded show every other week, but it's probably going to be like every 3 weeks or so, every 3 or 4 weeks. And we're just going to do live drafts. I like doing the live drafts. I like getting reps hosting live content. So I want to continue to do that at least a couple times a month with some great guests lined up. So I appreciate everybody. If you're interested in this conversation, we have a lot more of it in our Discord, which is patreon.com/ALLGAS. You can find everything over at destinationdevy.com. Like, subscribe to this channel for all the content and all the content creators. With that, I will go ahead and sign off for the week. Be chill. Okay, let's get it. Bitch, let's get it.